to manipulate collectives. But I'd be very careful in thinking that on the basis of this, there is a real traumatization of the collective. Example, Serbia and the war on the what's it called in English? The Amselfeld, what's it in English? You know, 500 years ago there was this, and Milosevic made reference to this the whole time. Huh? Yeah. You call it the Kosovo field. Anyway, the point is, when that war happened, Serbia as a national state didn't exist. So it's ridiculous to assume that the national state of Serbia received a traumatic wound there. Because the whole idea of national states is 19th century. So I disagree with Volkan when he thinks that there are so very real wounds which somehow have been through the generations transported and which facilitate this chosen trauma. I agree with him when the idea of chosen trauma is an idea of using a myth or a reality in the past which allows us to invent significance about them and then sell it to the population. And in my opinion, the less real that myth is, the better. For example, when the Nazis think that Jews are something really dangerous, that's a very clever myth, because it has no reality, factual reality whatsoever in Germany. But there's a long history of this, because we think the Jews killed Jesus. We forget sometimes that Jesus was a Jew himself. But there's a long history of anti-Semitism in Europe, and the Nazis very cleverly pick that up and further develop it. And they pick up on fears that were real in the population. They pick up on feelings of humiliation that were real in the population. So they facilitate really a chosen trauma in the German population as means of political manipulation. But again, careful, Jews weren't a threat to the German population. And this is, I think, this is where my criticism to this idea of chosen trauma appears. I think collective traumas do not exist. I think trauma is something that happens individually, although I do think that collectives are affected by massive traumatization. I think something like a collectivization of traumatic experiences happen. I think that collectives affected massively by trauma clearly begin to include that into their general, their social reality and their social mythology. And I think, for example, that the Holocaust becomes such a reference to Israel. I think that the Nakba becomes such a reference to Palestinians. But I think it would be very wrong to imagine the Holocaust as a collective traumatization of the Israelis. Historically bullshit. Because the collective of Israelis as such didn't exist at the time. And there were people in Palestine fighting for the state of Israel who were not part of the Holocaust. Or Palestinians suffered the Nakba, and the Nakba is a collective memory of severe of many people being hurt and humiliated. And that experience of humiliation is a key reference in political discussion of Palestinians. But it's not collective trauma. So my opinion is very clear. Let's be careful about two quick analogies. Now, I'll give you the word in a second, because these are provocative hypotheses. You can discuss it in a minute. Just give me a chance to finish, and then we can really start discussing, okay? Very quickly. I think in ongoing conflict, you have to be clear about that you're always dealing with threat and fear. You have to understand that people dissociate and understand in order to survive. So they suffer, but they don't show their suffering necessarily to you. And then suddenly, when you don't expect it, it'll jump at you. I think you have to understand that in ongoing conflict, people adapt to the threats. So there will be sometimes very passive, sometimes there will be more hopeless than their situation, because being more hopeless is a good protection. If I live in the middle of shit I can't get away from, the best way is to think that no way can anybody get out of it. So don't mistreat people because they're hopeless. Understand what kind of survival strategy is behind that. Understand also that when people suffer terribly, there might be something which I privately for myself call like traumatic stupidity. They might not be able to think. Last year I worked in Palestine with psychiatric colleagues who have excellent training all over the world. They're really good. But they were so out of their minds after what happened that several of them felt they had nothing to say to any patient ever and again. And we started talking and they started thinking again. But for a moment, several of them stopped thinking. That happens. I think you should never forget that living in situations of war implies living in humiliation and shame very, very often. I think in acute terror, there's very little you can do. I think in chronification, you can at least acknowledge these things. You can, and thus, always think about empowerment. And you have to understand that you yourself will be affected by the horrors you see. This is what we call secondary traumatization. And thus, finally, also security issues should be thought about, and self-protection. And if you're in post-conflict situations, you have to think about ongoing fear, ongoing trauma. You have to think about submission and authoritarianism as survival strategies that were good in conflict but are bad in post-conflict. But it's not easy to overcome them. You have to understand that many things will not be repaired and cannot be repaired, and that promising that they will be repaired is a way of making destruction even stronger. You have to ask yourself about the vicissitudes of reconciliation. You have to ask yourself, who wants reconciliation? For what? Usually it's the perpetrators who first speak about reconciliation. Then it's the international community. Reconciliation at its best is a very long process. And let me say very clearly, reconciliation is not something you can force onto anybody. Not even if you're Archbishop Tutu. You just can't do it, it doesn't work. And the key question is, how important are the victims really? In our political change theories, are we really interested in what the victims feel? Or are we using the victims as a cliché for peacemaking? I think, and I feel very strongly about that, that in many regions of the world, victims are absolutely abused in the process of peacemaking. and that there has been way too little attention paid to this indicator. In that sense, justice, in my way, should always be justice also for the victims, not just in an abstract way. And finally, I said it in the beginning, if I think conflict is something healthy, then peace and harmony isn't really my perspective. But my perspective is win conflict capacity back. Now, all of that happens, and I'll do this very quickly, in what I call the culture of lies. Because the donors have their agendas, the receivers have their agendas. I evaluated in Bosnia a project of trauma treatment. They were doing 6-month treatment with traumatized soldiers. I asked them, I never have heard of anybody traumatized who overcame their trauma in 6 months. How do you do it? They said, our program says that we have to do it that way. And I said, well, what do you do after the 6 months? And they said, well, you see, we have these little clubs where our clients come to, and we go there also. And they go there for the next 2 years, and we discuss in the evening in a very informal way with each other what to do with life in general and in specific. And I said, have you ever told your donors about it? No, because we're scared that they'll cancel our money because maybe they think that our treatment is ineffective. And I said, well, it's the other way around. Actually, the most interesting part of your treatment is what you're doing in your clubs. The other part is really boring and actually not effective. But you're not going to convince your donor of that as long as you don't talk about it. So it's on both sides difficult. Clients have a very difficult wish. And we worldwide now have ways of dealing with these things which are rather complicated. First, we have the bombs we pay for. Then we come and have trauma centers. Then we focus a little bit on income generation and maybe also on good governance and democratization. And then we have our exit strategies. And this is what I call from war to health to wealth to nothing, which is the way in which we, in our good post-imperialist way, try to help worldwide. So, and then we have this strange animals that run around the planet, peace builders and mediators, who expect to be, and other helpers like myself, I include myself in this group of strange animals. Supposedly we're helping, and we expect people to believe that we're helping. That I always find fantastic again. I mean, if they're in their right mind, all of them, the first thing they should do is mistrust us profoundly. And we can be as nice and good people as we like. They should mistrust us. And we should mistrust ourselves, because we're part of power structures which continue to be very real and very asymmetric. And then finally, we send people around the world to evaluate the work we do. And we pretend to be very neutral or Swiss about it. And that also, obviously, is a lie. So, to finish, I don't think there are any good roles in this. But I think there are opportunities to reflect contradictions. And I think you can only do good work, be it as a psychologist or be it as a mediator or as a peace builder, if you're willing to analyze the contradictions of your partners and your own also on a very, very personal level. Thank you very much. And now I'm very happy to engage in all kinds of discussion, whatever you like. Yes.
Yes, I would like to pick up a point you said about trauma, and there's no kind of collective trauma. I want to refer to the Palestinian case, which I know a bit because I have lived for 2 years in Jerusalem. And to my feeling and to what I could observe, there is kind of a collective trauma, in the sense even people, Palestinians, who have not experienced in direct suffering the exodus from their territories, from their parents and grandparents, they hear the story of the Nakba, and they are conditioned in the ways they act today, you know. Also, I think in all their activities, in the way they approach Israelis, this trauma of the Nakba and the trauma of the continuing occupation is there, and it conditions their way how they relate to Israelis, and it makes it difficult to find an open way to deal with each other. So
absolutely,
I don't think that there is no notion of collective trauma. I think there is a notion, and this notion of collective trauma makes the way to find, to build the peace between communities like Israel and Palestine so difficult?
I think several things to that. I think what makes peace between Palestinians and Israelis most difficult is the inequality of power present to the very day we're sitting at right now. I think, secondly, that I completely agree with you that the reference to the past is very, very, very strong. It's just that I wouldn't call the Nakba a collective traumatization. I think you can hurt collectives. I think that in the way individuals represent their collectives, these references can be key. And I think that there is absolutely no doubt that the relationships develop just as you're saying. I think the difference is that I wouldn't call that a collective trauma. I would call it collectivization. I would call it a collective that has been hurt as a collective deeply, that, by the way, continues to be hurt deeply, and that the reference to this being hurt as a collective, that is what they express. But I would not call it a collective trauma. So it's like, maybe this is like a discussion about words, but I want to be...
A semantic difference. I mean,
I want to be very careful with certain... That's what I tried to explain before. I want to be careful with certain analogies because they pretend that something like... they don't allow you... For example, they make differences disappear between people or the way they relate to that. And I'm always very much interested, especially because of trauma, to facilitate differentiation also. But maybe it's more a semantic discussion. I think, for example, a clear issue where you can see a collective being destroyed is in Guatemala, in the kind of genocide the military organizes against the indigenous population. And there's no doubt that this collective was seriously hurt. But again, I wouldn't speak of a traumatized collective, because the notion behind this traumatized collective is that this destruction sort of that you can look at the collective in an analogy to a body. And I think that's structurally wrong. Although I wouldn't deny that the collective has been hurt. But I would always insist in looking very closely at the same time who, how, and what, and how we describe that. The same way I do when I speak with Palestinians. For example, in Gaza, that's something you have very often. You have thousands of people who have been generations and generations of being refugees. You ask them, where do you come from, or what are you? And they say, I'm a refugee. And to our own feeling, how can you be a refugee for the last 50 years or something like that? But it's actually part of their identity construction, right? But that doesn't mean that the person you're talking to, who might be 18 years old, in their history is only a refugee traumatized by the Nakba. And that's why I'm sort of wanting to differentiate that. But maybe there are other opinions. Yes, please.
You say there is a collective identity, or would you say there is no such thing as a collective identity either anyway?
I think identities are constructed always between the individual and the social surrounding. And I think identities aren't static. Identities are defined by the way all of you see me and the way I see myself in relationship to you. And this is a continuous process. So I think identities are not something static, and they're not simply defined by the collective, nor simply defined by the individual, but they're issues of negotiation with the collective. So you belong to a collective, undoubtedly, of Germans or Swiss or Palestinians or whatever. You belong to a group, but the identity in an individual sense is much more than your collective participation in it.
So, David, I think you're onto something very interesting. I'm not sure I understand it yet. So let me see if I do. So the reason that you think collective traumatization is a bad category is it creates the probability of it being used to perpetuate, advocate for a particular type of exclusive policy, because it will maintain a legitimacy of us versus them. Am I on the right track? So, okay. Part of when we do encounters between Israelis and Palestinians, or Greeks and Turks, or any of the people who have been in identity-based conflict, part of what we're trying to do, I think, is help them build a more robust identity, which includes some perspective taking about the other. Right? So part of how I do that, others do that, is by having folks tell stories from their past, and then be able to acknowledge that those stories are meaningful to each other. The story I told on Monday about the girl who talked about her grandfather not being able to go visit the house where the key was. Actually, the most important part of that story for me was when she said, "And I understand why they wouldn't let me in." Because that ability for someone who is part of what's been called a collective trauma usually can't get out of that, and she could. So I'm wondering if what you're saying is that we're legitimizing people staying in a kind of a pre-developmental stage. And one more point. One of the most interesting things I find about folks who have chosen traumas, if we use Bamek's notion, is some who come out being very justice-oriented, and some who come out being very ethnocentric and aggressive. And I don't know why they come out which way. And that maybe you're helping give us some new ways to think about these dilemmas.
I guess that's what I'd hope to do. If that works is another question. And understand that some of these things sound so convincing, but that would always be my feeling, that the real danger with the term collective traumatization is that it defines a type of collective victimhood you cannot question further. And you know, it's like when I sit in Germany at the university talking with students about our issue with foreigners. And obviously the very easiest thing to do is to ask everybody what's their family history. And you find that 90% have some kind of mixed cultural background, which is a story most of them somehow know, but usually don't think about, because they think of migrants and non-migrant, and I'm not migrant, and maybe my mother was a migrant. You know, it's very easy. If you know a little bit of history, you know that millions of Germans were refugees at a certain time because of the results of World War II. So you don't have to be very creative to know that. But it's something that you can block out by saying, we are, and another issue where this is, by the way, a big political discussion in Germany is in reference to the so-called Vertriebene. As you know, from the former eastern part of Germany, which today is Poland and was Czechoslovakia, many Germans were expulsed at a certain time. And their political orientation in Germany is more right-wing. And there's been an ongoing discussion, especially with Poland, about a memory space for these people. Will this be a memory space for all people who were forced into exile? Or will it be a place that differentiates the history, that, for example, understands that many of the Germans that had to flee, first of all, were put there by the German government during the war because they wanted to conquer these places also. So there's a complicated discussion, and it's very interesting. The representative of the Vertriebene, she has always argued this is for all exilees. She doesn't want to differentiate, and she wants to say, we are as much victims as you are. That's the key message. And I think this whole question of collectivization is important. We have to think about the collective dimensions of trauma, and we have to think about the societal dimensions of trauma, but not by inventing collectives that as such maybe didn't even exist when the trauma happened.
I would like to ask the question regarding also collectivity. I think there are different levels of collectivity. There's one level which you would probably agree on, more like social or legal collectivity, in terms of that members of an association or habitant of a city, your collectivity by structures, for instance, legal structures that exist, that you adhere to something. But then I think there's also something like emotional collectivity, where you share something with other peoples. It can be on different levels. Either you had an experience together, it can be a good or a bad experience, or you share maybe, for instance, religious belief or something else, and you have some kind of, in that case, more emotional connection to these people. Not like statutes of an association, because both of you are members of an association. There's nothing you can touch, nothing you can see, but there's something like an emotion between people. Not an emotion, rather maybe a belief or a shared experience, but on a rather emotional than on a structural level. How can we call this? Would you not call this collective whatever?
Yeah?
All this the collective traumatization, it reminds me very much of the collective representation, this old Durkheimian concept, where for me things run a bit in a direction where, and the representation is a construction, is something what we produce as well. And the second term, which reminded me very often, which I would prefer to the collective traumatization, is actually Roland Barthes' modern myth, where sort of the experience of many individuals construct together a kind of a focal point where these people can, which form which form this kind of focal point where you find your idea for gathering together. Or I mean, it is, and it just comes to my mind now. It is this Durkheimian idea of the elementary forms of religion again, where religion certainly produce some kind of this gathering point. And yeah, another example, and then I'll be finished, is this famous image of Vergil in the Aeneas, this very early, where he describes how Aeneas with his father and his son gets out of this burning Troy. And it is very important for Vergil to note that Aeneas is carrying his father on his shoulders. He holds his son, I have forgotten his name, and he carries the Laren, the Roman house gods with him as well, which he takes to the new place. So it is very important that he gets these identification, these pieces of identification for the group, for the collective, that this go with him as well. So, I mean, I don't know whether that is my question, is that, can we think, or would you agree that it runs a bit in this direction, that it isn't really anything experienced, the collective traumatization, but it is something constructed due to a personal experience, certainly, a personal experience of many, many individuals.
Yeah. Obviously, I completely agree with you. I think we make constructions, we develop culture, and obviously in all these issues you have collective constructions, or which grow collective. But I think in the issue of trauma, it's absolutely key not to forget the individual body. And we're a group here, but we don't have the collective body. If you kick me, you kick me, and you can kick every one of us, you know. But still, the memory of the kicking will be in each one of us, while at the same time we make a collective construction about why you started kicking us. And we can later on, but we should not accept an analysis that will make the specific bodies disappear from our discussion.
Yes, I agree. And I think this discussion is really important because if we say the word collective, then this actually hinders us to analyze as well. And because, I mean, when we say collective, it's made up as a fact. So this is a collective. So the Jewish were a collective. I mean, everyone knew that. No, it was not like that. It was made up as a collective. So it was a collectivization. And this word like shows or gives a view for this function. And if we say collective, we don't see the political dimension really. And this you see within the word collectivization, because it shows the political process that actually stands behind that. And I find really important, yeah.
Yeah, since there is this connection to the body, my mind is turning around the